Religion as the counterbalance to mass-mindedness. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it, from every wholesome restriction, all sociopolitical movements standing in the direction invariably try to cut the ground from under their religions. For in order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything beside the state must be taken from him. But religion means dependence on a submission to the irrational facts of the experience. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions, they concern far more the individual's psychic attitude. But it is possible to have an attitude to the external conditions of life only when there is a point of reference outside them. The religions give or claim to give such a standpoint, thereby enabling the individual to exercise his judgment and his power of decision. They build up a reserve, as it were, against the obvious and inevitable force of circumstances to which everyone is exposed, who lives only in the outer world and has no other ground under his feet except the pavement. If statistical reality is the only reality, then it is the sole authority. There is then only one condition, and since no contrary condition exists, judgment and decision are not only superfluous, but impossible. The individual is bound to be a function of statistics and hence a function of the state, or whatever the abstract principle of order may be called. The religions, however, teach another authority opposed to that of the world. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on God makes just as high claim upon him and as the world does. It may even happen that the absoluteness of this claim estranges him from the world in the same way he is estranged from himself when he succumbs to the collective mentality. He can forfeit his judgment and power of decision in the former case for the sake of religious doctrine, quite as much as in the latter. This is the goal of the religions openly aspire to unless they compromise with the state. When they do, I prefer to call them not religions but creeds. A creed gives expression to a definite collective belief, whereas the word religion expresses a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical extramundane factors. A creed is a confession of faith intended chiefly for the world at large and is thus an intramundane affair, while the meaning and purpose of religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or to the path of the salvation and liberation, Buddhism. From this basic fact, all ethics is derived, which without the individual's responsibility before God can be called nothing more than conventional morality. Since there are compromises with mundane reality, the creeds have accordingly seen themselves obliged to undertake a progressive codification of their views, doctrines, and customs, and in so doing they have externalized themselves to such an extent that the authentic religious element in them, the living relationship to an indirect confrontation with their extramundane point of reference, has been thrust into the background. The denominational standpoint measures the worth and importance of the subjective religious relationship by the yardstick of traditional doctrine, and where this is not frequent, as in Protestantism, one immediately hears talk of pietism, sectarianism, eccentricity, and so forth. As soon as anyone claims to be guided by God's will, a creed coincides with the established church, or at any rate forms of a public institution whose members include not only true believers but vast numbers of people who can only be described as indifferent in the matters of religion and who belong to it simply by force of habit. Here the difference between a creed and religion becomes palpable. To the adherent of a creed, therefore, there is not always a religious matter, but more often a social one, and as such, it does nothing to give the individual any foundation. For support, he has to depend exclusively on his relation to an authority which is not of this world. The criterion here is not to lip service to a creed, but the physical psychological fact that the life of the individual is not determined solely by the ego and its opinions or by social factors, but quite as much, if not more, by a transcendent authority. It is not ethical principle, however lofty, or creeds, however orthodox, that lie the foundations for the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but simply and solely the empirical. I can only point to the fact that the psychological opposition between these two realms of experience is not only vouched for in the New Testament, but it is still exemplified very plainly today in the negative attitude of the dictator states to religion, and of the church to atheism and materialism. Just as man, as a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence and his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere except in an extramundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this, he needs the evidence of inner transcendence experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. Merely intellectual or even moral insight into this stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man is a negative recognition only, and amounts do not much more than a wavering on the road to the atomization of the individual. It lacks the deriving force of religious conviction, since it's merely irrational. The dictator state was one great advantage over bourgeois reason. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. The state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions, and state slavery is a form of worship. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trends towards mass-mindedness. The result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanatism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. Free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed, on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod, beyond good and evil, and his votaries are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, missionaries. There is only one truth, and beside it no other. It is sacrosanct and above criticism. Anyone who thinks differently is heretic, who, as we know from history, is threatened with all manner of unpleasant things. Only the party boss, who holds the political power in his hands, can interpret the state doctrine authentically, and he does so just as suits him. When through mass rule the individual becomes social unit, and so, and the state is elevated to the supreme principle, it is only to be expected that the religious function too will be sucked into the maelstrom religion, as the careful observation and taking account of certain invisible and uncontrollable forces is an instinctive attitude peculiar to man, and its manifestation can be followed all through human history. Its evident purpose is to maintain the psychic balance, for the natural man has an equally natural knowledge of the fact that his conscious functions may at any time be thwarted by uncontrollable happenings coming from inside as well as from outside. For this reason, he has always taken care of that any difficulty decision likely to have consequences for himself and others shall be rendered safe by suitable measures of religious nature. Offerings are made to the invisible powers. Formidable blessings are pronounced, and all kinds of solemn rites are performed. Everywhere and at all times there have been rites the entry the sword, whose magical efficacy is denied and which are impugned as magic, and superstition by rationalists incapable of psychological insight. But magic is above all a psychological effect whose importance should not be underestimated. The performance of a magical action gives the person concerned a feeling of security, which is absolutely essential for carrying out the decision. Because a decision inevitably somewhat one-sided and is therefore rightly felt to be a risk, even a dictator thinks it necessary not only to accompany his acts of state with threats but to stage them with all manner of solemnities. Brass bands, flags, banners, parades, and monster demonstrations are no different in principle from ecclesiastical processions, cannonades, and fireworks to scare off demons. Only the suggestive parade of the state power endangers a collective feeling of security which, unlike religious demonstrations, gives the individual no protection against his inner demonism. Hence he will cling all the more to the power of the state, to the mass, thus delivering himself up to psychically as well as morally and putting the finishing touch to his social depotentation. When the rationalist directs the main force of his attack against the magical effect of the rite as asserted by tradition, he has in reality completely missed the mark. The essential point of the psychological effect is overlooked, although both parties make use of it for directly opposite purposes. A similar situation prevails with regard to their respective conceptions of the goal. When the rationalist directs the main force of his attack against the magical effect of the right as asserted by tradition, he has in reality completely missed the mark. The essential point, the psychological effect, is overlooked, although both parties make use of it directly opposite purposes. A similar situation prevails with regard to the respective conceptions of the goal. The goal, religion, deliverance from evil, reconciliation with God, reward in the hereafter, and so on turn into worldly promises about freedom from care for one's daily bread. The just distribution of material goods, universal prosperity in the future. In order not to repeat myself unnecessarily, I shall not enumerate the parallels between worldly and otherworldly beliefs, but shall content myself with emphasizing the fact that a natural function which has existed from the beginning, like the religious function, cannot be disposed of the rationalistic and so-called enlightened criticism. You can of course represent the doctrinal contents of the creeds as impossible and subject them to ridicule, but such methods miss the point and do not hit the religious function which forms the basis of the creeds. Religion, in the sense of conscientious regard for the irrational factors of the psyche and individual fate, reappears heavily distorted in the deification of the state and the dictator. Naturam expellas furca tamen usque recurret. You can throw out nature with a pitchfork, but she will always turn up again. The leaders and dictators, having weighed up the situation correctly, are therefore doing their best to gloss over all the obvious parallel with the deification of Caesar and to hide the real power behind the fiction of the state. Though this, of course, alters nothing, as I have already pointed out, the dictator state, besides robbing the individual of his rights, has also cut the ground from under his feet psychically by depriving him of the metaphysical foundations of his existence. The ethical decision of the individual human being no longer counts. What alone matters is the blind movement of the masses, and the lie has thus become the operative principle of political action. The state has drawn the political conclusions from this, as the existence of many millions of state slaves, completely deprived of all rights, mutually testifies. Both the dictator state and denominational religion lay quite particular emphasis on the idea of community. This is the basic ideal of communism, and it is thrust down the throats of the people so much that it has the exact opposite of the desired effect. It inspires divisive mistrust. The church, which is no less emphasized, appears on the other side of a communal ideal, and where the church is notoriously weak as a Protestantism, the hope of or belief in a communal experience makes up for the painful lack of cohesion. As can easily be seen, community is an indispensable aid in the organization of masses, and is therefore a two-edged weapon. Just as the addition of, however, many zeros will never make a unit, so the value of a community depends on the spiritual and moral stature and the individuals composing it. For this reason, one cannot expect from the community any effect that would outweigh the suggestive influence of the environment, that is, a real and fundamental change in individuals. Whether for good or for bad, such changes can come only from the personal encounter between man and man, but not from communistic or Christian baptism and mass, which do not touch the inner man. How superficial the effect of communal propaganda actually is can be seen from recent events in Eastern Europe. The communal ideal reckons without its host, overlooking the individual human being who in the end will assert his claims. Chapter 3, the position of the West on the question of religion. Okay, maybe I'll skip this one actually. Chapter 4, the individual's understanding of himself. It is astounding that man, the instigator, inventor, and vehicle of all these developments, the originator of all judgments and decisions of the planner of the future, must make himself such a quantity negligible. The contradiction, the paradoxical evaluation of humanity by man himself, is in truth a matter for wonder, and one can only explain it as springing from an extraordinary uncertainty of judgment. In other words, man is an enigma to himself. This is understandable, seeing that he lacks the means of comparison necessary for self-knowledge. He knows how to distinguish himself from the other animals in point of anatomy and physiology. But as a conscious, reflecting being, gifted with speech, he lacks all criteria for self-judgment. He's on this planet unique phenomenon which I cannot compare with anything else. The possibility of comparison and hence of self-knowledge would arise only if he could establish relationship with quasi-human mammals inhabiting other stars. Until then, man must continue to resemble a hermit who knows that in respect of comparative anatomy he has affinities with the anthropoids, but to judge by appearances is extraordinarily different from his cousins in respect of his psyche. It is just in the most important characteristic of his species that he cannot know himself and therefore remains a mystery to himself. The differences of degree within his own species are of little significance, compared with the possibilities of self-knowledge which would be occasioned when encountered with a creature of similar structure but different origin. Our psyche, which is primarily responsible for all the historical changes wrought by the hand of man on the face of this planet, remains an insoluble puzzle and an incomprehensible wonder, an object of abiding perplexity, a feature it shares with all nature's secrets. In regard to the latter, we still have hope of making more discoveries and finding answers to the most difficult questions, but in regard to the psyche and psychology there seems to be a curious hesitancy. Not only it is the youngest of the empirical sciences, but it has great difficulty in getting anywhere near its proper object. In the same way that our misconception of the solar system had to be freed from prejudice by Copernicus with most strenuous efforts of a well-nigh revolutionary nature were needed to free psychology, first from the spell of methodological ideas and then from the prejudice that is the psyche in, on the one hand, a mere epiphenomenon of a biochemical process in the brain, or on the other hand, a wholly unapproachable and recondite matter. The connection with the brain does not itself prove that the psyche is a phenomenon. A secondary function causally depends on the biochemical processes. Nevertheless, we know only too well how much the psychic function can be distributed by verifiable process in the brain, and this fact is so impressive that the subsidiary nature of the psyche seems an almost unavoidable inference. Thus, the psyche is endowed with the dignity of a cosmic principle, which philosophically and in fact gives it a position co-equal with the principle of physical being. The carrier of this consciousness is the individual who does not produce the psyche on his own volition, but it is on the contrary performed by it, nourished by the gradual awakening of the consciousness during childhood. If the psyche must be granted an overriding empirical importance, so also must the individual who is the only immediate manifestation of the psyche. This fact must be expressly emphasized for two reasons. Firstly, the individual psyche, just because of its individuality, is an exception to the statistical rule and is therefore robbed of one of its main characteristics when subjected to the leveling influence of statistical evaluation. Secondly, the Church is granted validity only insofar as it acknowledges their dogmas. In other words, when it surrenders to the collective category, in both cases the will to individuality is regarded as egotistic obstinacy. Science devalues it as subjectivism, and the Church is condemned it morally as heresy and spiritual pride. As to the latter charge, it should not be forgotten that unlike the other religions, Christianity holds as its core a symbol which has for its content the individual way of life of a man, the Son of Man, and that is even regards the individuation process as the incarnation and revelation of God Himself. Hence, the development of the self acquires a significance whose whole implications have hardly begun to be appreciated. Because too much attention to external blocks, the way to immediate inner experience, were not the autonomy of the individual, the secret longing of many people. This hard-pressed phenomenon would be scarcely be able to survive the collective suppression either morally or spiritually. All these obstacles make it more difficult to arrive at the correct appreciation of the human psyche, but they count for very little beside one another remarkable fact that deserves mentioning. This is the common psychiatric experience that the devaluation of the psyche and other resistances to psychological enlightenment are based in large measure on fear, on panic fear, or of the discoveries that might be made in the realm of the unconscious. These fears are found not only among persons who are frightened by the picture Freud patent of the unconscious, they also troubled the originator of psychoanalysis himself, who confessed to me that it was necessary to make a dogma of his sexual fear because this was the sole bulwark of reason against a possible outburst of the black flood of occultism. In these words, Freud was expressing his conviction that the unconscious still harbored many things that might lend themselves to occult interpretations, as is in the fact the case. These archaic vestiges or archetypal forms grounded on the instincts and giving expression to them have a numinous quality that sometimes arouses fear. They are ineradicable for itself, for they represent the ultimate foundations of the psyche itself. They cannot be grasped intellectually, and when one has destroyed one manifestation of them, they reappear in altered form. It is this fear of the unconscious psyche which not only impedes self-knowledge, but it is the gravest obstacle of the wider to a wider understanding and knowledge of psychology. Often the fear is so great that the one dares not admit it even to oneself. Here is a question that every religious person should consider very seriously. He might get an illuminating answer. A scientifically oriented psychology is bound to proceed abstractly, that is, it removes itself from just sufficiently far from its object not to lose sight of it altogether. That is why the findings of laboratory psychology are, for all practical purposes, often so remarkably unenlightening and devoid of interest. The more the individual object dominates the field of vision, the more practical, detailed, and alive will be the knowledge derived from it. This means that the objects of investigation too become more and more complicated, and the uncertainty of individual factors increases proportionally to their number, thus increasing the possibility of error. Understanding enough, academic psychology is scared of this risk and prefers to avoid complex impunity. It has full freedom in the choice of questions it will put to nature. Medical psychology is very far from being in this more or less enviable position. Here the object puts the question and not the experimenter. The doctor is confronted with facts which are not of his choosing and which he probably never would choose if he were a free agent. It is the sickness of the patient that puts the crucial questions. In other words, nature experiments with the doctor in expecting an answer from him.